Hey everybody, thank you for coming. I'm Ed Friedman. For those of you that don't know me, I chair Friends of Miramichi Bay. Before I give you my whole spiel, I'll start with thanking Patagonia down in Freeport for sponsoring this event for many, many years. And because it costs us well over $1,000 to put on, they give us some product from the store to act as an incentive for a door prize. Odds are not as good tonight as they've been other nights. Got a nice big crowd, but this is a nice something or other. Wow. Hoodie thingy. They say it's going to get cold again, actually, after tomorrow. It's going to be like 57 degrees tomorrow. If you'd like to be eligible for a door prize and help us out, there's I'm going to pass the basket around, write your name on a little slip of paper from there, put it in the cute little teddy bear tin, and drop like $5 or something into the basket. Great, and then our speaker will do a drawing at the end, and we'll pick a winner. Okay. What size is that? What size is this?
One size.
One size fits all.
Bigger than usual.
Yeah. And we used to say you could exchange them, but they say actually you can't, so they make a nice re-gift now if you do win, and it's not the right size.
Are you going to be at the Patagonia thing on Friday nights?
Not that I know of. This says here, women's chinchilla poncho, navy blue, extra small. I don't think so. Yes, maybe. Oh, okay. Oh yeah. Looks pretty good.
Why don't you try it on?
Looks pretty good size. Try it on. So, okay. The winner can try it on, right? So, for those of you that don't know, we are a very unique organization, Friends of Miramichi Bay, in that we take a holistic approach to the environmental issues around here. We're actively engaged in research, advocacy, hardcore advocacy sometimes, and we are a land trust, so we protect land, and we have an education program, of which this is one of the components. So over on the table here, obscuring this great artwork, are a few of our multi-panel things, some examples of some work. But last summer, for example, we did a 10-year update on changes in aquatic vegetation and upland habitat in the bay and around the bay. We're finishing up that report now. We also broke ground and did some real archaeology digging up in Dresden Falls, the most significant prehistoric site in the state of Maine. And that took us about 6 years and about $600,000 to protect from a subdivision. So we have been working the last few years on the Presumpscot River with colleagues from Friends of Sebago Lake to try and restore fish to that river, prevent what's probably going to happen, unfortunately, from happening, which is trading off a short-term gain in the Westbrook area for migratory fish in exchange for no more fish in 90% of the watershed until at least 34 years from now. So they've just made a deal down there to get better fish passage in Westbrook in exchange for closing down or getting rid of fish passage at 2 dams upstream.
Why?
Which is horrible. Talk to SAPI and the 2 main environmental groups that work with them to do that. Again, short-term gain. I think their thought originally is money, but the rationalization was that, well, if fish get past Westbrook, it'll be years before they get to these other 2 dams. And they're only about 7 miles upstream. And last year, after SAPI got their required permit to amend their license from the DEP, they were not forthcoming with how many fish had passed just below Westbrook. And those numbers came out after they got their new license, and there were 50,000 river herring. So the fish are coming back. Given habitat and enough starter fish, they can come back pretty well. And we use data from the Kennebec and the St. Croix where we've seen that happen to try and make that happen. And so far unsuccessful, I think. But that's the kind of work we do, and a lot of groups don't do that. So we protected about 11-12 miles of shoreline around the bay. Mostly valuable spawning and nursery habitat for fish. Valuable wetlands, protected about 1,200 acres or so around the bay as well. So we do that as well, but it's just a part of what we do. Everything we do is dependent on volunteers pretty much. We have typically one staff person. And one great example will be May 14th, our Spring Bay Day. If you're interested in this stuff at all, it's a great opportunity. If you have something to offer in the way of environmental education, you'd like to share with fourth graders. We have fourth graders from all around the bay out getting really dirty, getting away from their computers. They're in the mud, they're catching fish, they're doing real archaeology, going on various nature walks, and just having a great time being kids and learning about the bay. And we use a lot of chaperones to help get these kids from one station to the next. There's 3 50-minute sessions during the day, and there's a free lunch if you do this for us, right? And so we have presenters and we have chaperones, and then the schools bring chaperones as well. It's a really fun day. And in the spring, it's at Chop Point School in Woolwich, which is an incredibly powerful spot, right where the whole bay empties out. And for those of you that don't know, the bay drains almost 40% of all the fresh water in Maine and some of the fresh water in New Hampshire. And it's all going through this 200-meter bedrock slot and then on down about 17 miles to Popham via the Kennebec. So it's a cool spot to be. If you have trouble walking, it's not a huge area to walk in as opposed to our Fall Bay Day, which is at a wildlife management area in Bodenham, which is like a 350-acre site. And there's a bunch of walking often there. But Chop Point, that's all like very powerful right there. Very cool spot. So see me afterwards if you're interested, or check on the sign-up sheet. There's a spot for volunteering, and just make sure I can read your information that you write down, and we can get in touch with you. So education, advocacy, research, and land conservation. With that, I'll move to introducing our speaker, Heather, who I just had a great dinner with, and we had a good time together, I think. And Heather founded the Wild Seed Project, and she'll tell you more about that. But she's got 30 years of expertise working around plants. She's been an educator for many years. She propagates plants and did that for years. She's got a background in landscape design and conservation. She was head plant propagator at the New England Wildflower Society's Garden in the Woods in the 1990s. And FYI, for those of you that don't know, the New England Wildflower Society has a parcel of land in Woolwich that actually...
and I'll be leading a field trip there in the end of August.
End of August. And it's one of a number of properties that we monitor, even though we don't have any conservation easement or anything there. We sort of do it as a good neighbor for the society, and it is adjacent to a easement property we have, and there's a trail that goes between them as well. So it's a great little spot, and if you come to Bay Day, you'll come right by it probably as you turn onto Chop Point Road. So you can do a little reconnaissance, right? So she's worked at a number of landscape architecture planning firms, specialized in ecological design, worked on a number of research projects with USAID, National Gardening Association, and MOFGA. She's lectured nationally, published nationally, a number of journals and magazines, Horticulture, American Nurseryman, and many of you might be familiar with Deb Sewell of Vienna Botanicals. Heather designed did the master gardening plan for Vienna Botanicals up in Rockland. And she's got a BA in plant ecology from Hampshire College and a master's from the Conway School of Landscape Architecture. And I'll just say quickly before Heather comes up, come around. We have these events the second Wednesday of each month from October to May. And our next event will be the second Wednesday of next month, whatever date that is. And our program will be Art Spies and Leith Smith, two archaeologists from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, talking about the dig we finally did in Dresden Falls this past summer. And hopefully that'll be good. All right. Heather.
Okay. Can people hear me? This works. Is it work? Is it on?
So that's not a microphone for you, that's for the camera, so just put that on somewhere here. But we do have a person here who will appreciate, yes,
do you think
headphones, so.
I'm going to have to wield two things.
Yeah, so you can test it out.
Yeah, can you hear me?
As long as you keep speaking like that and
Yes, I will work on it, and you speak up if I don't. Well, I'm thrilled to be here. I've spoken. Can you hear me? Closer?
Okay, hold up.
Okay.
Get it
I'm
right.
thrilled to be here. I have spoken at the Brunswick Library a couple years ago, and my topic tonight is wild plant reproduction. And that's what I've spent my whole adult life professionally doing. And I love this picture because you can see up close some seeds of some of our most beautiful native plants. The left is the wild Canada lily, which is not common in Maine anymore, and those seeds look golden. Then the middle is witch hazel, and on the right is milkweed. And flowers are all about sex and reproduction, and with the end product being the seed, which is the next generation, and it's the result of the mixing of genes. That's why sex was invented. And no, a lot of people have forgotten that, and they've forgotten that with flowers. People think the beauty is all for us. We're just lucky that we see them as beautiful. And so each seed is a unique individual in the same way that you and I and anyone in your family is. If you have more than one sibling in your family with the same parents, you have seen how different, even with the same parents, two individuals can turn out. And that's what's really important, and that I want you to go away with tonight. Understanding why we need to keep growing plants from seed, not cloning, which is the norm in the nursery trade today, which means lots of our landscapes are planted with clone plants, which means there's no genetic diversity. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to show you a bunch of different sort of typical types of reproduction in our different native plants, and I'm going to go through them sort of starting with the early spring bloomers, then moving all the way to the late season bloomers. And from that you'll learn the different ways that they flower, the different pollinators, and then the seed ripening. And the beginning ones I start with are going to be the woodland wildflowers, because they're the ones that bloom first in the spring. You know, they evolve to come up before the trees leaf out, do their whole life cycle, and then disappear. And then after that, I'm going to move into describing in a little more detail what's going on in the nursery trade with native plants. And then I'm going to show you how to sow the native seeds. So in the beginning, you're going to hear these really complicated ways to reproduce. Don't worry about that. When we get to the end, you'll learn simple ways to do it. And actually, fall is the time. Fall and winter is the best time to sow native seeds. So we're going into spring now. There's still some species you can sow now, but we're really past the big window when you do most of the seed sowing. So let's see if I can make this work. Do I have to point that? Okay. Ah, oh no. Oh. Uh-oh. I pushed the... You think I shut it off? Any techie person there? I pushed this one. That's what she said.
Okay. This is not our area of expertise. The light's on up there, sort of.
There, okay, good. Okay, I'm going to start first by talking about what the word native means. So wait, how are we going to get it to work? This is a picture from the Camden Hills, and remember, 12,000 years ago, there was nothing growing here. The glacier had just retreated from the coast of Maine, and this was all rock and ice. You know, not ice, rock and gravel and sand. There was no plants here. And where did all our plants go? They all, migrated south to sort of the Gulf of Mexico, the coastal sand plain communities down southeast, and in some mountain refuges in Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia. Most of our native flora is millions of years old, and for the last 2.5 million years we've had multiple ice ages. So our plants have moved north and south before. They know how to do that. What's different today is the rate that they're going to need to move, but they have experienced that before. And so with each of those north-south migrations, different species move at different rates. And if you just, Maine has about 1,600 native species of plants. There's about 2,100 wild plants. So a third of our plants that you see out in the landscape are actually not indigenous. They are from other parts of the world. Europe, Asia is where most of them comes from, because that's the continent that has a lot of climate similar to ours. So, often the word native is used sort of what was growing here pre-Columbian. But just remember, that's only a snapshot in time. And what's happened since then is that we have brought so many new plants here. So, we have changed the dynamic. And wild plants are very different from cultivated plants. Most of our garden plants are, especially vegetables and annual flowers, those are all from tropical or Mediterranean climate. That's why you plant the seeds when it's warm in the spring. Well, that's very different from ours. Okay, I'm going to try again. Where do you think I'm supposed to point it? There. Oh, good. Okay, so we're starting now in early spring. This is late April. And you're looking at the yellow is trout lily and the white is wood anemone. So these are two spring ephemerals, which means they come up in the spring, they do their whole life cycle, they bloom, they produce seeds, and then they completely disappear. Both these species are completely gone by mid-June. And the trout lily is one of our woodland lily species, and they're some of the wildflowers that are the most slow-growing and difficult to propagate. And so after that flower goes by, it's pollinated by early bees. You'll get a seed pod that's about 8 inches off the ground, and it's green and maybe a ½ an inch in diameter. By early June, the leaves are all disappearing. The seed pod and stem have fallen on the ground. It's turned tan, and then it'll split open, and ants actually come and collect the seeds. And the seeds a lot of woodland wildflowers have seeds that are ant dispersed, and they have this little fleshy protrusion. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. That is what the ants are after. It's high in fats and protein, and they carry the seed off to their nest. They eat that fleshy appendage, and then they deposit the seed in the equivalent of an ant compost pile. And so it's under the leaf litter, underground, moist, humid, and those seeds will lay under the ground. The next spring you will see no germination. It will be the second spring before it germinates. And with the trout lily, it's a dozen years before a seed will bloom and become reproductive. Those seeds also cannot dry out. So if you picked those seeds and carried them home and let them dry out, you'll kill them. And when they do ripen, it's within a couple hours, the ants know that they're ripe and carry them off. So this is a classic example of a woodland wildflower that's slow and difficult to propagate, and there's very few nurseries who are doing that. Most of the time when you see this for sale, it's been dug from the wild. The wood anemone, its seeds, after the flower goes by, it gets a little green cluster of seeds, and they also by mid-June have fallen off the plants, and the ants carry them off, and they will germinate the next spring. So they're not quite as slow, but they're 5 years to reach blooming size. Okay, bloodroot. Bloodroot's not common in Maine, but I know where some wild populations are. So this is another early spring bloomer. It's pollinated by teeny little native bees and flies. By the way, there are about 230 species of native bees in Maine. So they're bumblebees and all kind of little teeny species, most of which don't even sting. So these are get pollen. If they're open sunny days, the flower will be open. If it's rainy or really windy, the flower closes up, and so they don't get pollinated on those days. And within a week, the whole population, the flowers will be finished. They'll fall off the plant. That looks very beautiful when the petals fall down. And then about 6 to 8 weeks later, it gets a 2 to 3 inch long green kayak-shaped seed pod that again splits, and within an hour the ants are there to carry off the seeds because they're after that fleshy protrusion, and like the trout lily, they eat it and then deposit the seeds in their compost bin. And they'll lay underground, and then with this species, the next spring they'll germinate. But it's usually 3 or 4 years before that seedling will flower. You know, our native perennials, they're much more slow growing than annuals. And one of the things that makes them so resilient in the landscape is that in their early years, they put a lot of energy into developing a healthy root system. And it's called bloodroot because the root is about the thickness of your finger, and when you break it in half, it looks like a chopped off bloody finger. It's very, very dramatic. Marsh Marigold. This is another wildflower, more open woods, ditches. It's a wetland plant, and this used to be much more abundant than it is today. Especially, you know, the roadside ditches now get gouged out by excavators. So this plant could be flourishing on roadside ditches, but not with the way the roads are managed. So it blooms for about 3 weeks in May, and again pollinated with these tiny little bees. And then after the flower goes by, you get a green seed cluster of seeds in the pods, and then when they ripen, they split open, and you can see in that picture the little teeny green seeds. So when they actually will then fall out, you know, over a couple-day period when it's windy, and where they want to land is in damp mud. So being a wetland plant, in spring when they're blooming, the water level's high, and then by mid to late June when the seeds are ripened, usually the water's receded a little, and there's some nice damp mud. That's just where they want to land. And these will actually germinate within a couple weeks of the seeds falling. And then by the end of the summer, you have little plants, and then they're blooming by the 2nd or 3rd year. Trillium. This is the purple trillium. Do you have any of this on your land at Merry Meeting?
Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's about 4 native species of trillium in Maine, and this is the one that I feel like I see the most of. So it blooms again, usually for 3 weeks. The purple trillium has the maroon flower color. That's an indicator of who pollinates it, and it's flies. It's actually flies that usually go after, you know, decayed bodies. So, you know, if you stick your nose up in the flower, it's called sticking Benjamin. It doesn't really smell like rotting meat. But if you've ever been to the tropics and seen all the maroon flowered plants, they really reek like a piece of dead animal. So anyways, after it's pollinated, it takes about 3 months from when it flowers before the seed pod is ripened. That's about 1 inch across. And then it's very firm to touch. And then all of a sudden, one day, it falls off. And like the other species, the ants are there within an hour. And I know this because I collect all these seeds. And if I'm not there right away, you miss it. So you can see the brown seeds and that creamy colored fleshy protrusion. That's what the ants are eating and dispersing it. And there's 2 species of woodland ants that do all the New England seed dispersal. So if they're not in the woods, let's say you planted, you know, some woodland wildflowers in your woods that had been depleted of them, you might have to wait, you know, a while before ants come back and find it to help them with their reproduction. So those seeds, again, need to stay moist. They can't dry out. If they dry out, it kills the seeds. And they will germinate the 2nd spring, in which case you'll get a seedling that's maybe 1 inch long by 1/4 inch wide. The 3rd summer, you'll get the classic 3 little leaves on an 8 inch tall plant. And in year 7, you might get the first bloom. So again, when you see this for sale at a nursery, most nurseries today aren't even propagating anymore, but very few do. So if the person who's selling them can't tell you how they propagated, I can guarantee they've been dug from the wild. The one person I can vouch for in Maine is Fernwood Nursery in Liberty. He's a real propagator, and he does grow these from seed. You can also do divisions. You don't produce a lot of plants, so you should expect to pay a high price. Again, it's not hard to grow them. They just have a really slow reproduction. Pink lady slipper orchid. So this is a classic example of a wildflower that doesn't want to be tamed. And the reason is it is completely dependent on fungi in the soil for its whole life cycle. So, there's been a lot of interest in the news lately about mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, this relationship between trees and fungi in the soil. Well, it's not just the trees. All of our native plants have associations with all kinds of different fungi in the soil. If the soil is a complex biome of microorganisms, the same way we've now learned that our gut are and that it's key to health. The same is true in the forest. Many plants can still live without that fungi if they get plenty of nutrients, and so they're the plants that we've figured out how to cultivate in a nursery. But some species, and the lady slipper orchids are one of them, they need the several specific species of fungi for the seed to germinate and for the whole plant to live. So these plants tend to bloom for about a month if you're lucky, usually mid to late May into June, and they're pollinated by bumblebees. And so it's very tricky for the bee to get in there. There's just a little opening up at the top underneath that hood, and they have to squeeze inside. Now the reason the pollinators are pollinating is not because they're trying to help the plant spread its genes around. They're after nutrients. So nectar is really high value food, and pollen, they eat pollen too. Well, when they get to the bottom of the orchid where they're expecting to see the nectar, these don't actually produce any nectar. So the bee just went through all this trouble and didn't get anything. So they'll climb out and fly to another flower, and after a couple flowers they usually give up. So if you had a stand of lady slipper orchids and there were 100 flowers and you came back later in the season to see how many had seed pods, usually just about 10% of them produce seed because the bees are smart and they like, this isn't worth it, and they don't bother. Luckily one seed pod has thousands of teeny dust-like seeds. So it produces a copious amount of seeds, but they have to land in the conditions these plants like, which is the real acid woodlands, and that's probably why they're dependent on the fungi in the soil, that the really acid soil holds on to nutrients or has less nutrients in it. So this is a wildflower that you should appreciate and enjoy in the wild and not, covet for your garden because nobody's propagating it. A couple of the other lady slipper orchids, the yellow lady slipper and the showy lady slipper, which are on the endangered species list in Maine and all the New England states, they can be propagated slowly from divisions. But again, these are not plants for us to all relish in their garden because there's not ever going to be a supply out there. So now I'm going to move on to some of our woody plants. We have lots of native shrub dogwoods and viburnums. This is the pagoda or alternate leaf dogwood, a lovely small tree. A lot of our native dogwood and viburnums have these white frothy flowers, and they're pollinated by little teeny bees and flies, so little teeny insects. And then later in the season, they produce fruits that are really high value for migrating songbirds. So in this picture on the left, you're looking at the nannyberry viburnum, then the highbush cranberry viburnum in the middle, and the silky dogwood on the right. These fruits are higher in protein and fat than a lot of our invasive plants like the honeysuckle and barberry. Those are much sugary, and those plants are from Asia, and probably the migrating birds there need more sugar in their migration, but they're not nearly as good a food source. These plants are also incredible host plant for butterflies and moths. So everybody knows how the monarch butterfly has to have milkweed for its reproduction. But that's not a unique relationship. All of our native insects have associations with native plants. That's this, they've co-evolved together. And so the different all of our native trees and shrubs host lots of species of butterflies and moths in their reproduction. So they might have flowers that they visit for the nectar, but it's that the butterfly needs to lay its eggs on these plants, that their caterpillar only likes highbush cranberry viburnum. So these seeds you collect, when a plant produces a seed with a fleshy fruit, you can judge ripeness the same way you would if you were buying a peach or cherry in the market. When the flesh softens, that is an indication that it's ripe. And they're all designed to go through the gullet of a bird or maybe a small mammal, so you need to remove the flesh. And you need to sow them right away. They can't dry out. If they dry out, you'll kill them. Most of our shrub dogwoods and viburnums, when this fruit is ripe, the seed inside, the embryo inside, is not fully mature. And a lot of these species range from here all the way down to Georgia. And they probably evolved during a warmer time period. And so they need another month or two of warm weather for that embryo to finish maturing. Then the seed needs to go through a winter cold period to break dormancy, and then they'll germinate in the spring. Because we're in Maine at the northern end of their range, by the time these fruits ripen in late August and September, it's already too cold here for that embryo to have enough warmth to finish maturing. So most of these plants have a double dormancy because when the seed gets deposited on the ground by the bird, they're not mature, the embryo is not mature, so it just rides out that whole winter. The next summer it finishes maturing, and then the following spring it will germinate. So it's not hard, it's just slow. Oops. So same thing with nuts. This is American hazelnut, but all our oak trees, hickories, beech nuts, all the native nuts, you need to collect them fresh and sow them right away. And so the trick with the nuts is getting them before the squirrels. So especially hazelnuts, probably the hardest one to get. The squirrels just get them all right at once. So, say you want to propagate an oak tree, just, when you see the acorns falling on the ground, collect them. And what you don't want to do is let them sit on the dashboard of your car or in your kitchen. You will kill them within a day or two. So bring them inside and put them in a bucket of water. I like to soak them in a bucket of water overnight. And the reason is that some of them, some little insect will have made that acorn its home. So again, it's an insect that is probably native and probably needs the acorn for its life. So if they have moved in there, those acorns will float. They won't be heavy. And so those ones you won't want to plant. So once you've soaked them overnight in water and seen the ones that sunk, then you can plant them the next day. So this might be September or October, and you need to plant them outside. In a little bit I'll tell you how to protect them from squirrels and rodents. If you're not prepared to protect them from squirrels and rodents when you plant them, then put them in a Ziploc bag and put them in the refrigerator until you've got set up for rodent protection. I once left some hickory nuts outside for like 5 minutes, and when I came back, it looked like, the local juvenile delinquents had the squirrels will find it really quickly. So you could leave them in the refrigerator in a Ziploc bag and wait until early April and plant them. You can do that because the refrigerator will be cool enough and they're moist that they will get that winter. But as I'll show you in a minute, sowing the seeds outdoors is really the easiest. Okay, so we've got about 25 species of violets native to Maine, and there's some of the sand violets are from open sandy areas. Actually, graveyards are a great place to see a lot of the native open-land violets because, they were, the good sandy soil was grabbed up early by the colonists for graveyards, and so while they might have been grazed, they were never plowed and planted. So there still can be remnant dryland native wildflowers there. And so this is one of the sand violets. And so they bloom for about 3 weeks in May usually. And they're pollinated by little teeny bees. And after that, you can see the flower before it opens is kind of hooked like that. There's one in the middle of the picture, and then it opens up. And then when it forms a seed pod, it stays like this. It's about maybe half an inch long little green seed pod. And then a day or two before the seeds ripen, it points up and splits open. And there'll be little golden brown seeds inside. And often they'll fall out from the plant. And they also are dispersed by ants. However, these seeds, they can dry out, so you can collect them, put them in a paper bag, and then wait and sow them outdoors in the fall. What's interesting about violets is they have a secondary set of flowers that they do in the summertime that you never see. So in usually late June, July, if you look at the base of the plant, you'll see little unopened flowers, but then they disappear and they bury underground. The same way that's how peanuts grow. And they bury underground. In the picture on the right, those seeds aren't quite right, but those are the seed pods, and so they never get fertilized. They're actually clones of the mother plant. Each seed is a clone. And it must be that being a spring bloomer that the plant has learned that there's a lot of springs where there's rain for 3 weeks and they don't get pollinated, so they've developed this secondary way of reproducing. Columbine. Columbine's a really interesting wildflower because you'll see it on sunny, rocky ledges right on the coast of Maine. It also is common in rich, deciduous forest woodland ledges. And it's the ledgy part or the well-drained, sloped land that it needs. It does not like being mulched around it, so if you have a very flat garden and you tend to put a lot of mulch down, it often will smother the plant. But it tends to bloom for about 3 weeks in May, early June. It's hummingbird pollinated, so it's fun to watch the hummingbirds come get it. And then about a month later, where the flowers were, you'll get a tan seed pod that has little black seeds inside. And one plant will produce, if it has a lot of flowers on it, it will produce thousands of seeds. And it's very easy. It's easiest is just to let it self-sow, and it will really find its place in your landscape. Like the best thing is just to plant one or two and then let it seed in and tell you where it wants to be. But those seeds can be stored dried, and then they do need a winter cold period to germinate well of at least a month. Bluets, so this is common in people's often lawns even, and people will mow around it when they're blooming. They're teeny little plants. But then once it goes by, people tend to then mow the lawn, and you're mowing it before it's had a chance for the seed to ripen. It takes at least a month to 6 weeks after it blooms before the seeds ripen. And if you want to save some seeds on these, stick some flags there because they're so tiny, the little seed stalks, and they're just little teeny dark brown seeds, and you can just collect the pods and go sprinkle them. If you have like stepping stones or a stone wall, just sprinkle them anywhere where there's a little gaps between things, and they can come up. So the seeds don't have to stay moist, and they don't even need a cold period, but you just need to not kill them by mowing them. Jack in the Pulpit. So this is one of the northernmost species in what's mostly a tropical, the arum family. And these are that purple color that are gnat, fungal gnat pollinated too. And so this is the northernmost species. And so it comes up really late in the spring. It's, if you get out in the woods and know where Jack in the Pulpits are, they are not one of the early wildflowers to come up. They really wait till some heat kicks in, so it must be them remembering their tropical ancestry. So Jack in the Pulpit, most plants have flowers that have male and female sex parts. The stamens and the pistils are the sex organs. Some plants have separate male and female flowers. So hollies, people know how you have to have a female holly and a male holly to get the berries. And then there's a smaller percentage of plants that can switch back and forth from year to year. And Jack in the Pulpit is one of them. So the flower is actually in here, so you'd have to cut it open to know when it's blooming. But it's very easy to just come back later. And if where there was a flower, there's a emerald green cluster, usually 2 inches across, of a shiny green fruits. And then they turn red. Those are the seeds. And it tends to be, if it's had it takes more energy to produce seeds. So if we've had bad years, you'll have more male flowers. And in years with good rainfall, you'll have more females. So it's very easy to collect those seeds and squeeze the seeds out, and you can just sow them right away, or you can even store them dry and sow them in the spring. Being tropical, they actually don't have to have that winter cold period to break dormancy.
Excuse me.
Yeah?
Is there anything in particular that tends to take the seed and move it around? Because
Yes.
like all over here.
Yeah, you know who disperses them is turtles. And Maine does not have a lot of turtles. You know, we're kind of at the northern end where most of them have migrated. So obviously, I think some mammals do too. But when I was at the New England Wildflower Society in Massachusetts at the Botanic Garden, the nursery where we had all our jack-in-the-pulpit, and also, so anyways, the jack-in-the-pulpits were about 300 yards away from the pond, and it was also maybe 80 feet higher. And when the jack-in-the-pulpits ripened, you'd see all these turtles would come lumbering up. You know, it was a lot. They could obviously smell something, but they came a long way to come find them. But in Maine, there's also probably squirrels or other rodents, because there's somebody else that's dispersing them in Maine. But in other states, it's the turtles are the main one. Wild strawberry, this is a great native ground cover, also a great edible plant, and a great pollinator plant, and you can make tea out of the leaves. It's a really nice plant. And so the seeds on this plant are on the outside of the plant, and they're little seeds, and how you can just collect them when they're ripe and when you want to eat them. And the easiest way to get the seeds separated is to just smush them on a piece of paper or cardboard and let it dry, and then you can just fleck the seeds off. You could do that if you also wanted to grow blueberry or cranberry, any of the fruits that have little teeny seeds inside. Just smear them across a piece of paper. And you can store them dry and then sow them outdoors in the fall or early spring. They just need about a week or two of cold weather, and then they'll germinate. Wild geranium. So this blooms late May, early June. It's a beautiful wildflower. It ranges in color from pale pink to deep pink. It's also pollinated by both bees and hummingbirds. And after the flower goes by, it gets these seed pods. You can see it on the right. They're green. And then the day that they ripen, they turn black. And they spring off from the plant. So it's quite a trick to catch a lot of them, because you have to wait till they're turning black and then get them. And in the wild, they would spring off and land under the leaf litter and then germinate the next spring. They need a cold period before they germinate. Typically, if I were to sow 100 of these seeds, the next spring about a third of those would germinate, and the other 2/3 would wait the second year. And this is another very typical strategy of a wild, undomesticated plant, which is not to put all your eggs in the same basket and germinate all at once. That might be very convenient for, gardeners and farmers, but it's a bad strategy in a wild plant because, think of, yep.
So these multi-year life cycles, do they kind of overlap, or are they all in sync? So like you don't see a plant for 3 years just because, like you were saying in this case.
Yeah.
There is a strategy, but some of the other ones we were talking about, do they just happen to be?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the weather. Like if you look the last 3 years, remember last May and June, it did not rain. I bet most of the wild plants that germinated shriveled up and died. So, again, luckily with this plant, the seed from the year before, not all of them would have germinated, and they'll hope we'll have better luck this year. It's interesting when a lot of these plants, there's not been a lot of long-term research done on these plants, especially with such a slow life cycle. It's, hard to tell, but I've sown so many flats, say, of the Trillium seed. So no, what happens is you see 2 years later, you'll have a nice flat full of them. But of those seedlings, I said they took 7 years till they bloomed. Probably within that flat, some wouldn't bloom till 9 years. There'd be some variation on when they reproductive age, both based on that individual and where it grew in the wild. In a tougher place in the wild, they probably take longer to mature. And then some of these wildflowers live for decades, and others might only live 5 years. Again, it just really varies. So again, you collect the seeds, and you can store them dry too, but when you sow them, they will not all germinate that first year. And it's why I always tell people when they, if they had a flat that didn't germinate, don't throw it out. That very likely it will germinate the next spring. If you're really impatient and don't want to keep it in your little area, at least go in the woods and put it somewhere, because you will find seeds germinating many years later. Wild iris. So this tends to bloom in June, and it's also fun to watch the bees pollinate this, because they kind of go under this flap here to get to the nectar. And it's bumblebees usually that are visiting that. And then the seeds ripen in late September. So this is a really common wet meadow and roadside plant. But what usually happens is people mow their meadow in midsummer when it's dried out. And so these are perennials, so a perennial can be cut back in the middle of the season and it won't kill it. It will come back the next year, but it does stop the reproduction. And so long term, the seeds, most, children learn in science class, like the seed is the end of the life cycle of a plant. That's only true of annual plants. That's not true of perennial plants. Perennial plants live for years and will produce multiple seeds. But if you keep plants from reproducing, they're not going to get their descendants, making it into the future. So, this is one of the ways that all of our native plants are really being set back over time, especially the open area meadow ones. They're getting mowed before the seeds have had a chance to ripen. So the seed pods on these are they're big. They're about 1 inch across and maybe 3 inches long, and they split at the top, and it's filled with, each pod has about 100 tightly packed, shiny brown angular seeds. They're really beautiful seeds. And you can just store them dry in a paper bag and then sow them, and they'll germinate the next spring. So this plant here is going to produce hundreds of seeds. And so you can, versus if you were to dig that plant up and divide it, you might get 10 plants. You can produce a lot of plants when you sow seeds, and each one will be a unique individual. And some of those individuals are going to like our warmer, hotter, wetter climate. Some are going to like it drier. Some are going to love more pollution. They're all going to be different, and we need that genetic diversity to help us deal with futures. This is the swamp milkweed. So most people are very familiar with the common meadow milkweed. But we have there's 4 native species of milkweed in Maine. And the swamp milkweed is not, most of our wetland wildflowers, they've really, disappeared over the last couple decades between purple loosestrife and all the other wetland invasives. And so this one you don't see a lot around anymore, but it makes a beautiful garden plant. It's about 3 or 4 feet tall, big bushy plant, pink flowers, usually July, for almost a month in July. Pollinators love it. And so bumblebees, butterflies, obviously monarch butterflies. This is a fritillary butterfly. My plants are often covered with fritillary butterflies. And whenever the monarch shows up, they all bolt. Like, I think the monarch butterfly is some sort of bully or something. But so, like the other species, they lay their eggs on it's the foliage that the caterpillar needs to lay its egg on, because when those eggs hatch, they can only eat milkweed foliage. They can drink nectar of lots of wildflowers, but they have to have the foliage for it. So those seeds are ripe usually in late September or October. So again, in the common milkweed, it's even later than that. It's usually mid-October, sometimes later. So what usually happens, people let it bloom in their meadow, but then they end up mowing it before it's had a chance to reproduce. Yep?
I read that the monarch caterpillars eat the leaf in the shape of a letter C, because it has a cauterizing effect on the leaf, and the latex doesn't leak out.
What they do is they bite the stem. And then, so you'll see, you can tell if somebody's been there, because it will bite the stem and the leaf will be bent. and it won't die. It'll just be bent, and it keeps the sap from going. And by the way, the monarchs don't need flowers, milkweed flowers. They can see, if you have juvenile milkweed plants, they will come and lay their eggs on it still. It gives off some fragrance that they know about. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. So these are beautiful flecky seeds. I'll show you them in a minute. Bunchberry. So this is a real circumboreal plant. This grows all throughout Canada, Pacific Northwest, all through the boreal forest in Europe and Russia, in Siberia. This goes all the way around the world. And it's one of these seeds have to have a 5-month winter period before they'll be ready to germinate.